The multiculturalism in our society has always been something interesting to me. The multiple races, the multiple ethnicities, the multiple religions, the multiple beliefs, just how it all works together has always been something that piques my interest. You get to see, you get a little window to look into how someone else views the world. And that's one of the things that I find very interesting about life. Just the fact that someone could be looking at something, both of us looking at the same thing and seeing two way different things when we look at it. And that's one of my interests in multiculturalism as a whole thing in the first place. And probably why I did take the opportunity to respond to the video I was tagged in on TikTok. For those who didn't see that contemplation, then this YouTube video may not make much sense to you, or the podcast may not make much sense to you, but I'll leave a link to the original video that I replied to and probably to my original contemplation response in the description also. But someone asked there if I'm going to do a YouTube video, a longer version on it, and I said, okay, since there's enough requests for it, I will, even though the request at that moment was one. But you know those things where someone says on Facebook, I am going to take, if I get one like, I'm going to drink out this entire bottle of alcohol, and then you look and you see the one like is themselves. So I guess this was one of those situations where I didn't mind doing a longer version of it anyway, because if you understand it in too narrow a perspective, you could lose some of the meaning of it. So let's get into what we're talking about. If you haven't clicked that like button yet, please do click that like button or tap it or smash it, whichever one you prefer, and drop a comment. Tell me what you think. Tell me what you think about the video. When I'm finished, if you think I'm wrong, tell me about it. If you couldn't even make it through the whole video, well, tell me about it too. So one of the things at the beginning of discussing anything to do with racism, ethnicities, and multiculturalism, and the discrimination, etc. in Trinidad, one of the first things I like to point out, and anyone who has listened to enough of my content, or anyone who has listened to me in person enough speak, would know I like to point out to have some perspective on it. Because pointing out, okay, this is bad in Trinidad, this is bad in Trinidad, is one thing. Okay, fine, it may not be good, but you have to understand the human nature side of it. So in understanding that, you could look outside and see, where is there better? Is it possible? Is it feasible? Is it something that is easily feasible to get better? That's just one of the questions in that. And in that, the prime example that regularly pops up, and it regularly aggravates me till it's nearly funny to me now, it's the Swedish and Norway. And what about Norway? And what about Sweden? And what about Switzerland, etc., etc., etc.? Well, go look at the demographics of those countries. Go look in Sweden. I believe the ethnic majority in Sweden can trace generally their genealogy back to that same land for at least 12 generations. 12 generations of people in the same land. In Trinidad and Tobago, the two major ethnicities, the Afro-Trinidadian, the Indo-Trinidadian. 3 generations back, and the Indo-Trinidadians, probably even some of the youngest ones, maybe back in India. And probably 2 more generations back for some of the Afro-Trinidadians, and they would be back in Africa, or a few generations back, and some wouldn't be in Trinidad, they may have been in Barbados or Grenada or some one of the other islands or somewhere else. So this idea of comparing us to a place where these people have stayed there and settled and worked through a lot of their kinks over a very long period of time isn't a fair comparison. It just doesn't work like that. And even in Sweden, some of the ethnic minorities in Sweden, where there may be friction, there's nearly always friction between some of the majority and the minorities. It's just how societies function with the human nature problems and all. The minorities in Sweden, most of them can also trace their generations back to that same land for generations. Some of them are natives that could trace themselves back there 6,000, 7,000 years. So the comparisons just don't work like that. They have had much longer. Their diversity isn't the same as ours. Trying to work out some of the kinks here isn't the same as trying to work out some of the kinks there. The problem with all of this is multiculturalism in and of itself. A lot of people have been taught that multiculturalism is automatically a positive thing. And It's understood why it's taught that way. If you live in a multicultural society like Trinidad and Tobago, if you're living in a society like this, where it's a multicultural society already, to teach people like if a multicultural society is an impossible thing to happen seems kind of counterproductive to the country we live in. If it's impossible, then we're saying we're doomed to fail. But there are some people who try to argue, and probably within some reason argue, that multiculturalism may be the much more difficult one to try to get right. And it comes with the understanding of what multiculturalism means. So I got a nice quick definition and article here, and it goes through some of the basics of it. What is multiculturalism? Definition, theories, and examples. But we're not getting into the full sociology of it. We're just taking some key takeaways here. Multiculturalism is the way in which a society deals with cultural diversity, both at the national and at the community level. Sociological multiculturalism assumes that society as a whole benefits from increased diversity through the harmonious coexistence of different cultures. Multiculturalism typically develops according to one of two theories: the melting pot theory and the salad bowl theory. Okay, so here's the problem. Sociologically, multiculturalism assumes that society as a whole benefits from increased diversity. That's an assumption. That is not necessarily proven. But I could understand the assumption. And the assumption seems to be intuitive that if we have a wider array of things and abilities and options to choose from, then when it comes to finding solutions, finding a solution should be easier, because we have a much wider variety to choose from. With variety, you'd think you'd cover more bases, and I understand that. But when you're dealing with variety in terms of belief systems, you could end up upon a case where two belief systems are diametrically opposed to each other, or you end up with a belief system that says that in our belief system someone can marry at the age of 14, but in this Western secular culture, we believe that an adult is the person that needs to be married, and you aren't an adult until you are 18. And those things butt up against each other in a multicultural society. And if in the multicultural society we are all supposed to coexist together, and the aspects of each culture are all supposed to shine, how is that going to happen? And that's where we get to, within this bit of a sociological paper, we get into the two little definitions there: the melting pot theory and the salad bowl theory. If you're thinking about it, it kind of seems obvious what they're talking about. The melting pot is a melting pot. All the different cultures join into one, and they melt and eventually become basically one homogeneous new culture. So that's, you're no longer Indian, you're no longer African, you're Trinidadian. And all those old cultures have disappeared, and now they have melded and melted into one new culture. Now, the problem with that is cultural erasure. And many people don't really like cultural erasure. That's something that many people hold secret to them, their culture. And to say that I must lose aspects of my main culture and hold on to this new culture that isn't only mine, has bits and pieces of something else that I may strongly dislike. That's a difficult thing to get people to do. The pilau idea, that nice cook-up meal where you throw all the things in together and get one beautiful meal. It's possible. It's actually, to me, the most practical one, but it's difficult. Or the next idea with the salad bowl theory, where you have each culture has a separate there, the little bit of lettuce, the little bit of tomatoes, the little bit of whatever else you put in your salad, and hopefully some kind of meat for me. And they are all mixed in there together among each other, but they are separate from each other. And okay, but that leads to things where you'd see a Chinatown here, a Koreatown there, Jamaican town, Little Haiti, etc., etc., etc. But in the long run, would that allow for unity in a society? If we allow these things, these separate cultures to remain separate but try to keep them together, as they grow separately from each other with differing worldviews, would they grow into each other or will they grow apart from each other? And if we are saying that we are okay with them staying apart, how do we get one governing law over this entire group? What happens when if we are two separate cultures? You are the lettuce culture, I am the tomato culture or tomato culture. And on my most fringe end, it just doesn't agree with the lettuce. And on the lettuce most fringe end, it just doesn't agree with the tomato. So do the lettuce cut off that fringe end and throw it out of this salad? Or do they force it all to mix together and stay angry with each other in this one culture? Right now, if you're paying attention to the US news, they're suffering with some of that. Differing cultures that want nothing to do with each other, that one sees the other as evil and want to get rid of the other. Can you allow that to fester? But to get into some of the meat, it seems a bit late in this entire thing to get into the meat, but to get into some of the meat of what the first video was about and some of the difficult questions that we are hiding behind. As I said in my contemplation, I don't think some of those questions are really that difficult. Most of them, in fact, are not that difficult. The answers, if you read history, if you study history with an understanding of history, not just as some abstract subject you're doing in school, but as the history of events that actually occurred and have long-lasting effect going through time, even to us now. If you look at history in that sense, then a lot of the answers are there. So why do people live in one place and not the other? If any of you were looking at my content way in the early, drop a comment and tell me, and looked at the long video I did on the indentureship in Trinidad and Tobago. If you looked at that video and the paper I covered in that video answers a lot of these questions. The Indo-Trinidadians, when the sugar plantations eventually closed, went into continuing into agriculture, and also they were given some of the worst land in some kind of betrayal deal and given some land out in the middle of nowhere, and that's why some of the Indians live in South and Central Trinidad. And when the country was being built up in the 50s and 60s and the public sector was being introduced, many of the Afro-Trinidadians lived in that east-west corridor that was being built up, so those jobs went to them. There's this really interesting paper I found, the public sector in the Caribbean, an historical overview by Gloria Knight. It is very interesting. It isn't super long, but it goes through some of the history of how the public sector in itself was created in the Caribbean. And of course, Trinidad is in there. And part of what they were saying is, in understanding history, remember, we moved, this wasn't like some settlers came from a faraway land looking for some new land to settle, and they came here and they built up a civilization slowly as their family grew and expanded, etc. It was not like that. Before Trinidad became its own independent country, we were a colony. What we were accustomed to were foreign companies doing business here. Almost all the business that really made money in Trinidad and Tobago were foreign businesses, and all of that money went away. And as we gained independence, as we tried to become more independent as a country, what would replace some of these foreign businesses wouldn't be some small private person within these countries, but some of the more governmental agencies that were being created over time. And over time, what happened is we switched over from being dominated by the foreign private sectors and more being dominated by the local public sectors. And some of the Caribbean countries even went to the extreme on that side, with Cuba, Grenada, Guyana, all dabbling in some socialism or communism of some sort. And many of the Caribbean countries automatically adopted a system close to the Westminster system in Britain, where the state has control over a large portion of the economy. And then, if you combine that with the fact of which group of people were in charge of the state at that point in time, remember, at that point in time, many of the Indians in Trinidad and Tobago were seeing about their own self. They had their own culture. They turned inward for their own protection, and they were in the fields working and trying to get their children to succeed. And many of them did. So they weren't looking at the public sector in that light, while many of the Afro-Trinidadians who were in the more built-up sectors were literally living right there, and they would have been part of some of the people, such as the PNM party, that would have been working to get some of these things done. And something I regularly see, a misconception, I believe a misconception that many people have. I don't think both of the main major parties in Trinidad and Tobago run on race. I think one runs on race and one basically runs on class. The grouping of the people in those parties, in this party, the main party, the PNM party, isn't just based on race. It's based on the people that were within a certain class and a certain movement at a certain time. And that's who would have formed this People's National Movement Party. And that's why some of the people who are the UNC supporters, when they look across at the PNM, there is a kind of attitude, like some in the PNM attempt to look down in this direction, like they have less class. And that's why the UNC appeals more to the populist side of the country. That's at least the way I view it. And if you look at history with that angle, with those spectacles on, with that shade on, you get to understand that a lot of the questions you're looking at here do have pretty simple answers. We're literally walking through the tracks that were set there for us by generations gone before. And the question isn't why it is that way. We know that. The question is, can we face the reality of it being that way? And just to mention also, the Indian doctors part. I am not sure what it is. If I were to guess, I have no evidence for this. If I were to guess, I'd think it has something to do with the old Indian culture that pushes very strongly for schooling excellence. There are articles I remember coming out of India where some parents were literally climbing up the sides of buildings during some of their exams to try to get cheat sheets to their children.
Just how far parents in India will go to help their kids cheat. Some risk life and limb. They're climbing school walls to help the students cheat on tests. More than 1 million are taking high-stakes exams. Overwhelmed authorities are having trouble preventing the parents from passing notes with the answers to their children. Hundreds of students have been caught and expelled in recent days.
It could be part of the old caste system where you have a chance now to escape this class system where through education you can rise. I'm guessing here, that's what I think in trying to put some logic to it. It may be partly that, but it's obvious it isn't just Trinidad. Within the Indian culture, many Indians across the world strive to be at the top of their field, and it just so happens that in academy, doctors are part of the top of those fields. So in the United Kingdom, the Indian doctors over there make up something like 60,000 of the doctors in their NHS. Their National Health Service is about 60,000 doctors of Indian origin. And in totality, I believe right now it's less than 120,000 doctors in the NHS. That number fluctuates. The highest it went, I believe, was 129,000 in 2008. 125,000, sorry, in 2008. So it's almost half, or probably higher than half, of the doctors in the National Health Service in the United Kingdom are from Indian origin, and it's similar across the world. There's an entire group devoted to Indian doctors of Indian origin across the world because there are that many of them. So I'm not sure if that's a discriminatory thing, and I think that's another part of it. If we could understand history and understand the causes of some of these effects that we see, we'd understand and be able to identify what is discrimination and what is just a result of history, and how do we fix something when it's discrimination, and how we would fix something if it's just historical issues work and function differently. So how would you change the number of Indian doctors in Trinidad and Tobago? Would you demand a quota system that only so many doctors could be Indian in the country? That would be unfair. It's a matter of choice. So if we understand that, we could understand that the disparity in some cases, not all, in some cases, sometimes when you see a disparity in something and there's more of this person in this field or more of this person in this field, it's not because of racism or discrimination, but choices that have been developed over some lengthy periods of time. And maybe if you don't like the choices that people within your culture make, then work to improve the culture from inside. As I said in a previous video, it's about the culture. To me, when I look at it, it's nearly always about the culture. When you look at many of the instances where you're seeing certain demographics, like in the contemplation I pointed out, the Afro-Trinidadians seem to be overrepresented in violent crime. It's the culture that some people have held on to and think of it as their own culture, consider this their culture, and that's what it creates. And obviously, culture isn't created in a vacuum. There are other factors that influence what creates this culture. Yes, there's poverty. Yes, there's historical oppression. Yes, there's advantage that has taken place. But at the end of the day, it is your culture. If you are within this group, it is your culture. And you decide if you hold on to it or not. And that may very well be the difference between cultures that are successful and cultures that fail. How you work from that is up to you, I think. We can't change the history that has already been done and formulated the cultures. What you can do is work with what you have and attempt to change it from there. That's all I have for now. I hope you are educated, informed, or entertained. And drop a comment, tell me what you think. This is usually a fiery topic when it comes to Trinidad, but I hope in the form I did it, it's much less inflammatory and more informative. Tell me what you think. And I'll see you again Monday for the next video. Happy Republic Day if you are looking at it on Friday.
And you feel the music, rising with the time.